because the Lord is my shepherd. I have everything that I need. He lets me rest in meadows green and leads me beside the quiet stream. He keeps on giving life to me.
Hello, Port City. This is Thursday, May the 7th, and we are recording this message for Sunday, May the 10th, which is Mother's Day. And so, happy Mother's Day to everyone. It's hard to believe, maybe not so hard to believe, but it has been over 2 months since we last met publicly. That's a long time, and I miss you, and I look forward to seeing you again physically. I appreciate your generosity so much in keeping this church going during these difficult times in this crisis. We're going to be in Romans 8, and Chuck will have the verses and the main points up on the screen. Also, you have been sent an email that has the outline in an attachment. So if you want to print it out, you can be holding it while you watch this message. In Romans 8, one of the basic truths every believer needs to understand is God's purpose for their lives. Once we understand His purpose, we will be able to comprehend more fully why He allows us to face difficult circumstances like COVID-19 and other life challenges. I'm calling this message, How God Works in My Life. And we are going to survey one of the most quoted verses in the Bible, and that's Romans 8:28, considered a classic New Testament promise. This passage has sustained many believers through difficult trials by providing them with the assurance that the events of life are not meaningless. So let's look at the passage together. Romans 8:28, and this is from the New Living Translation. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. Incredible passage. I want to begin by making 4 negative observations based on this verse. First, verse 28 doesn't say everything in the world is good. It does not say everything is good. On a global level, there's diseases and viruses and wars. On a personal level, there's struggle in relationships and with finances and our health. So not everything in the world is good. It doesn't say it's good. Everything is good. 2, not everything works out the way that I want it to. That only happens in the movies and doesn't always happen in the movies either. 3, there's not always a happy ending. I wish everything had a Cinderella-type ending to it, but unfortunately it doesn't, and that's why we call it a fairy tale. And 4, God doesn't promise we will see the good. The verse doesn't say, God doesn't say, hey, I'm working all things together for good, and when you see it, you are absolutely going to fall in love with it. It is going to be so great and so incredible and beautiful. Doesn't say that we will see the good. Sometimes we get to see it, sometimes we don't. Romans 8:28 wants us to believe that God is working in the lives of those who love Him. So let's take a look at this verse phrase by phrase. We're going to break it down phrase by phrase. I have 7 positive observations from Romans 8:28. Number 1, we are certain God is working in the world and in our lives. Is this something you need to know during this virus crisis? It's something I need to be reminded of. In difficult times, on a national level, on a personal level, we need to be reminded of some things that we can be certain of and that we don't have any doubts about. So we can be certain God is working in the world and in our lives. The verse starts off with the words, we know, K-N-O-W, we know. And there are 2 words for know in the New Testament. The first word means you are in the process of learning and coming to know a few things as a result of your study. The second word, which is used in verse 28, means the knowledge of absolute conviction and certainty. And so what Paul is presenting, he is saying, we can know this with absolute conviction. We don't have any doubts about this. We know this for sure. So we can know for sure God is working in the world and in our lives. 2, we are certain God has a master plan. It says, the passage, we know that God causes. Look at that word, causes. Causes means he's the moving force. And from an eternal perspective, nothing is the result of randomness, fate, or luck. God is working behind the scenes in both the good and bad things that happen in our lives. 3, we are certain God's plan includes everything that happens to us. Look at this. We know that God causes everything. Everything. God's work in our lives encompasses everything. Financial problems, illnesses, relationship struggles, failures, as well as all of the good things we enjoy. You know, when things are going pretty well, it's easy to say God is good and God is at work, but he's working in the things that aren't so good also. And then 4, we are certain God blends all of our experiences together into his total plan. The verse says, we know that God causes everything, watch this, to work together. Nothing happens in isolation. God is weaving it all together. And his work in our lives is similar to baking a cake. In baking a cake, you have flour, salt, raw eggs, sugar, and oil. Eaten individually, that would be very bitter. You would not just eat flour. You don't just eat salt. You don't just eat raw eggs. You don't just swallow cooking oil. Well, maybe the sugar wouldn't be too bad, but you get the idea. Those ingredients would be very bitter on their own. But when they are eaten together as a cake, it's absolutely delicious. And that's an illustration of our lives. Your personal experiences taken individually are very bitter. There's a lot of bitter things that have happened. People who have not been fair or honest with you, maybe something in a divorce. A lot of things have happened that aren't good. Health issues, financial issues. Maybe people have taken advantage of you. But your personal experiences blended together form something positive and spiritually beneficial. And so we can be sure that God blends all of our experiences together into his total plan. And then 5, we are certain God's plan has a good spiritual outcome for our lives. The verse says, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good. Now, we all agree that not everything in the world or in our lives is good, but what we can be certain of is God's ability to make at least eternal good come out of our personal experiences, both good and bad. Paul's thorn in the flesh, the Apostle Paul, had some kind of a physical problem. He called it a thorn in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul's thorn in the flesh drove him to greater dependence on God. Peter's denial of Jesus pushed him to greater maturity as he becomes a leader in the early church in the book of Acts. Paul's persecution of the church led him to greater Christian commitment in taking the word of God all around the Roman Empire. We need to ask a very important question from a biblical perspective. What are blessings and what are curses? And the answer is, it all depends. If your physical possessions are leading you away from God and causing you to be weak spiritually, then they're not really blessings, are they? If a car wreck causes the loss of a limb and motivates you to serve God more deeply and compassionately, it's a blessing from a biblical standpoint because blessings can be hidden in things that aren't good. So we need to start looking at good from God's perspective and not just our own. Number 6, we are certain God's promises are for his people, the church. Verse 28, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. From an eternal view, everything ultimately works out bad for those who don't know God. It is not a good ending for non-believers. For believers, on the other hand, it is a good ending in spite of the negative events of life. Everybody faces negative events. Bad things happen. Bad things happen to good people. But in the end, it's going to pay off for you being a believer and having your trust and your faith in the Lord. Doesn't end well for the non-believers, but it ends well for the believers. And so we can be certain that this promise is for us. And then 7, we are certain of God's ultimate purpose for our lives. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Now watch this. Here comes God's purpose for our lives. Watch this. To become like his Son. So God uses everything that happens to us, both good and bad, to build Christ-like character in our lives. I think of God's work as a needlepoint tapestry. On the top, you see the beautiful picture created by the embroidery. But if you turn the tapestry over, on the underside, there's a bunch of jumbled threads and knots. And a lot of times, all we see is the underside. Whereas God sees the beautiful picture that he is creating on the top. So those are 7 positive observations from Romans 8:28. I want to share 2 biblical examples of God working all things together for good. Now, in the first example, God's work may not have been so visible to those who were personally involved in it. As we look back over the centuries, back through history, we can definitely see God's hand at work. But it wasn't so evident in the moment. And then in the second example, we're going to talk about a person who actually gets to see things work out for good. So in this first example, I want to talk about the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1. It's a very interesting example of God working through human choice and circumstances. People making bad choices, bad circumstances, but God is working through all of this to bring about his master plan of bringing the Messiah, Jesus Christ, into the world. Rarely were women mentioned in ancient genealogies, but there are 4 mentioned in Jesus's. The first woman mentioned is Tamar in Matthew 1 and verse 3. The story of Tamar goes back to Genesis 38, where Tamar seduces her father-in-law, Judah. And as a result, she gives birth to twins. Now, was that a good choice on the part of Tamar? No. Was it a good choice on the part of Judah? No. But God used it and included it in his plan. The second woman mentioned is Rahab in Matthew 1:5. At one time, she was a prostitute. I'm not saying she was at the time that the spies came into Jericho. But she at one time was a prostitute. But that did not prevent God from doing his work and working out his master plan. And the third woman mentioned was Ruth in Matthew 1:5. She was not a Jew, but a Moabite who married a Jew named Boaz. And then the fourth woman was Bathsheba. I don't know her name. Bathsheba means daughter of Sheba. We just use Bathsheba as her name. She committed adultery with David, although I don't know her level of willingness in that situation. Since David was the king called you, you probably had to go. But these women, all less than perfect, and these men, all less than perfect, are in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And they made at times bad choices. But God was able to incorporate all of that into his plan. And so here's the application. God's purpose is greater than the circumstances of life, even greater than sin. The second example I want to share with you is Jacob in Genesis 42. Now Jacob is upset because nothing seems to be going the way that he wants it to. Nothing in life seems to be going very well for him. Now he was the father of 12 sons by 4 women: Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Jacob thought his favorite son, Joseph, had died after being attacked by wild animals. He thought his son Simeon was dead. He thought Benjamin was about to die. And he thinks the rest of his sons and their families are going to Egypt to die. So it's not looking very good from his perspective. In Genesis 42:36, he says this: "Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin?' Watch this. 'Everything is against me.'" That's how he saw life. Well, guess what? Not a single thing he thought was against him was actually against him. Joseph isn't dead. He is the second most powerful ruler in the land of Egypt. Neither Simeon nor Benjamin are going to die, and his entire family is going to move to Egypt to be saved and avoid the coming 7 years of famine, but they're going to live one of the most honored lives outside of Pharaoh's family. And so the application is this: not everything was the way that it appeared to be. Now, I'm not saying everything you see isn't the way that it is. You see things that are bad, and they are bad. You see things that are good, and they are good. But sometimes there's some things that we think are a certain way, and it's not really that way. We have to believe that God is in the background working all things together for good. And maybe, occasionally, like Jacob, we can see it work out for good. In Genesis 50 and verse 20, Joseph is speaking to his brothers many, many years later after they had sold him into slavery. Not a very nice thing for brothers to do. But they had sold him into slavery and figured he was long gone. And this is what Joseph said to them. He said, "You intended to harm me." Notice their intentions were bad. Their intentions were not good. They had bad intentions. They knew they were making a bad choice, selling their brother into slavery. "You intended to harm me. But," oh, watch this, "but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives, including the lineage through which Jesus Christ will come into the world." So even when people hurt you intentionally, God has a purpose behind it and can bring good out of it. He never wastes a circumstance. Genesis 50:20 is the Old Testament equivalent of Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. So if you're a believer, remember that God overreaches everything that Satan does. And he overreaches our mistakes and sins and bad choices and uses them for his own purposes. He's working everything together for good. That is the hope we have as Christians. That's a part of the hope that gets us through difficult times. Life events are not meaningless, not from an eternal perspective. God's using them, and he's going to build Christ-like character in you through those circumstances. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to talking to you next time.
Shall be with me all of my life, and afterward I will live with